Hello everyone, time for a new talk on medieval Iceland. So in a previous talk, link in the card above, I summarized the general economic conditions of Viking and medieval Iceland and the hardships people had to deal with. So now we're going to look a little bit at how chieftains were doing. I remind you, Iceland consisted mostly of free farmers, but some of these were accepted as goðar, chieftains, by no means a central form of government. If you're hearing me for the first time, this is Irina. I'm a historian and a history teacher with the main focus on Old Norse religion and the Viking Age. So let us start. The sources of a goði's wealth, so the chieftain, in the early period have some understanding issues. That is mainly because the major historical writings, the Book of Settlements, the Landnámabók, and the Book of Icelanders, the Icelandingabók, give little specific economic information. The Grey Goose Law, the Grógós, on the other hand, is slightly more informative. Legally prescribed taxes and other sources of income allotted to a chieftain in the Grógós are, on the other hand, noticeably small. Þingfararkaup, which literally means the fee or bargain price, because of the word kaup, for traveling to the General Assembly, the Althing, was the most lucrative assessment a chieftain could legally impose. Upon demand, each Þingfararkaupsbóndi, that would be the Thing tax-paying farmer who possessed for each person in his household a minimum amount of property, a cow, a boat, a net, for example, had to pay the Thing tax to his chieftain. According to Ari the Learned in the Book of Icelanders, Gissur Isleifsson, Iceland's second bishop, carried out a census probably at the end of the 11th century and determined there were 3,800 Þingfararkaupsbændur. So the farmers who had to pay this. If the term 100 stood for 120, as was customary, then the number of substantial farmers at the time was approximately 4,500. So at the local springtime assembly, a chieftain was permitted to require each ninth Þingfararkaup farmer among his followers, his thingmen, to accompany him to the Althing. The goðar then collected the tax from the thingmen who stayed at home and used the funds to compensate those who accompanied them to the Althing. This payment to the farmers was also called Þingfararkaup. The size of it varied, probably in accordance with the distance from home to the assembly. The only other major tax available to the early chieftains was the hoftollur, that would be the temple tax, so before Christianity. Most of the little that is known about this tax comes from the Örbylgja saga, which, like all Icelandic family sagas, was written in later Christian times and therefore not really a trustworthy source of information about pre-conversion religious practices. In chapter 4 in Örbylgja saga, we have the information that all persons were required to pay a tax to the temple priest for all his trips. The concept that the chieftaincy did not offer much financial advantage, but instead might have been a drain on the chieftain's resources, was prevalent in studies for a long time and for good reason. The chieftains had their main source of income in the control of law, said some scholars, but didn't really elaborate on the observation. We nowadays also have a couple of questions which remain unanswered. So, for example, how did the goðar survive from the time of settlement until the 1200s when a profitable tax first came into use? Although the precedent of farmers paying chieftains was established by the earlier tax, the two levies are quite dissimilar. Þingfararkaup, I mentioned before, was a payment by specific individuals for a specific purpose, and then we have the Sauðatollur, the sheep tax I mentioned in the other video, which was a general levy. Furthermore, the fact that farmers at the end of the Free State, so before the domination of Norway, understood how taxes functioned does not mean that they accepted the right of the big chieftains, the Stórgoðar, to impose them. To the contrary, bændur in the 13th century clung to their centuries-old privileges. Later sagas in the Sturlunga compilation, for example, tell us that in the 1240s and 1250s, the farmers were often reluctant to accept the new claims of the big chieftains. At times, they openly refused to provide these leaders with supplies. Besides taxes, the chieftains had certain other privileges, such as the right to set prices on wares that foreign merchants brought into Iceland. The purpose of this practice was to control the greed of foreign merchants, allegedly, as suggested in the Grey Goose Law, though neither the date nor the enforceability of the clauses are known. Although some windfall profits might have arisen from price setting, it was not as lucrative as one might expect, because in most instances the Norwegian merchant retained the advantage. If dissatisfied with the chieftain in a particular region, the merchant could try to find a more compliant chieftain in the same area. For a Gothi, the value of the privilege was probably that it gave him the first choice of imported goods. This was significant in a society in which gift-giving, loans of precious items, and displays of hospitality were used to increase political power. Expansive feasts and hospitality are frequent in literature, and we can often judge the quality of a relationship between a chieftain and his followers by whether he sent off his guests with good gifts. For the Icelanders, the increase in the cost of imports was especially distressing because the prices they received for their exported goods did not rise similarly. Nor were the Icelanders in an advantageous position to negotiate better trade terms. After the mid-12th century, almost all their overseas trade was handled by Norwegians, who seemed to have at times colluded on fixing the prices of goods. Another irregular source available to the chieftains was gained from managing a court of confiscation, Feronsdommer, for the benefit of the claimant. It was usually held 2 weeks after the closing of the thing, at which a judgment had been obtained. The property to be confiscated needed a chieftain to take care of, so to apply the law. For the service of officiating at the confiscation of property against a lesser or a full outlaw, the chieftain was legally entitled to a remuneration of 1 cow or ox, and the remaining property was divided among the men of the region. In itself, this fee was small, especially in view of the dangers inherent in leading a prosecution for someone else and then confiscating the defendant's property. Should a Gothi be in the position of confiscating the property of an outlaw with himself as the injured party, however, he would receive not only his fee, but also a claim to a substantial part of the remaining property. Furthermore, he would be in a favorable position to determine the specific allotments. When a foreigner died without an heir or partner, certain rights of inheritance accrued to chieftains. Another source of income was in assuming the role of trustee, fjorðveislumaður. Chieftains settled issues of inheritance and managed the property rights of widows, minors, and unmarried women. A significant change in the chieftains' flow of revenue resulted from the introduction of the tithe, the church tax. Iceland's was the first national tithe in all Scandinavian. It was also the first true tax in Iceland's history. An important feature of the tithe law was that a chieftaincy, a goðorð, an otherwise marketable commodity that could be bought and sold, was declared to be not wealth but power, and thus was tax exempt. Possessions of the church, including farms on which church buildings stood, were exempt from the tithe. This tax-exempt status had important consequences. Families in the 12th century often donated large parts of their land holdings to the church under agreements allowing them to retain administrative rights over the property for themselves and their heirs. The tithe was divided into 4 parts: for the bishop, the priest services, the upkeep of the church building, and the poor. A person who controlled or owned a farmstead with a church on it was often in a position to collect 2/4 of the tithe. At first, many Gothar perceived this tax as a means of increasing their wealth. The custom of lay administration, or hereditary wardship of churches, a custom that granted a level of control almost equivalent to ownership, began shortly after the conversion, when landowners, both farmers and chieftains, built churches on their property. Churches after consecration were returned to the guardianship of secular individuals and their heirs by a form of enfeoffment resembling a feudal contract. Theoretically, the ownership of the property passed to the church, but in practice, the control of the land, along with the added benefits that came from the presence of a church building, was regarded by secular landholders as a hereditary right. Besides tithe payments, some church owners could also collect dues, called tollar, from churchgoers. Many studies have stressed the control of staðir, so that would be the farms with churches on them, as the principal source of wealth for the chieftains in the 12th and 13th century. However, the tithe did not establish the Gothar as leaders. Traditions of leadership were firmly in place when in the late 11th century the chieftains used their law-giving power to reap benefits from a new form of revenue. The same was not true throughout the country. Especially in the West Fjords in the north, gaining control of such farms with churches on them was not an absolute prerequisite for power. Attempts by individual or families to achieve hegemony over local areas had been a feature of the Icelandic body politic long before the effect of the church tax. An important possibility to get richer was, of course, trading. Exports were chiefly raw wool, different grades of homespun cloth, and a type of woolen cloak, the vararfelder. Though through this specialization they obtained, at least in one area of production, a comparative advantage that lowered their costs, making it feasible for them to participate in international trade. The goods were produced by a widespread cottage industry, and woolen products became a useful vehicle of exchange within the country. Along with merchandise derived from sheep raising, some trade was conducted in other farm products, for example horses, hides, sometimes cheese. A big problem here was the lack of ships. Most of the Icelanders who became full-time international merchants moved abroad, operating principally out of Norway. Even for well-equipped foreign merchants, the Iceland trade was difficult and time-consuming. Although better able to compete than their fellow Icelanders for the modest gains of trade, the chieftains played only a passive part in controlling the flow of goods or in regulating prices when compared with the role played by foreign merchants. The schedule of trading and the choice of goods, as well as the quantity and quality of the articles traded, were in main determined by the merchants. Only in the mid-14th century, when the trade in stockfish, that is, skreið, dried cod, was first developed, did Europe discover in Iceland a product of great commercial value. Once started, Iceland's stockfish trade grew rapidly. By the second half of the 14th century, the export of skreið and the industry that grew up around it had become firmly entrenched. Dried cod remained the principal export, although the trade diversified in the 14th century and 15th century when the English merchants also showed interest in acquiring stuff like fish oil, falcons, and sulfur, and perhaps also wool and hides. Another possibility was rental land, as slave labor does not really work in an environment where you can't engage in long-term agriculture. It is apparent that renting of land was a widely established practice by the late 11th century, when the sources become somewhat more reliable. It was not large households and important groups that secured power and reputation for the chieftains over the century, but the ownership of land and the income from rental property. Extensive tenant farming was possible because many sizable family holdings included rentable property, especially outlying lands. In particular, a main or head farm, the so-called aðalból in the Grógós, played a pivotal role in the Icelandic system of land distribution. These farms existed because the original land holdings from the settlement days were not continually being divided as the year passed. Many scholars have connected the aðalból in Iceland with allodial landholding, a tradition of ownership common in Norway, whereby certain land was the possession of a patrilinear descent group defined in relationship to a specific ancestor who was a landholder. Unlike allodial land, however, in Iceland it was not the exclusive possession of a patrilinear descent group. Allodial land passed to often remote relatives, but Icelandic heirs seem to have been mostly drawn from immediate kinsmen. An aðalból tended to remain under the management of a family member, or at least it could be neither sold nor rented without specific agreement by the legally responsible male heirs. So in conclusion, land ownership as the principal source of a chieftain's income requires an important mention. The Goðar, the chieftains, by no means monopolized the ownership of land. Substantial parcels were a major source of wealth for many well-off farmers who far outnumbered the Goðar in their midst. Each source of income mentioned contributed to the wealth of the Goðar. So all these taxes, both formal and informal one. None of them, however, does explain the full extent of the chieftain's wealth or power. So this is something we still need to explore in Icelandic studies, the underlying system of wealth, particularly in this period before the time of settlement and, let's say, the 1200s. All right, so I hope you found out something new, something interesting about, well, an isolated part of medieval Europe. And if you liked the presentation, feel free to like, subscribe, and also consider becoming a patron. All the best to you, and